The sun was just beginning to rise, painting the sky with soft shades of orange and gold. At a private airport on the edge of the city, a sleek white jet stood ready for departure. Its silver wings caught the early light, making it look like a bird prepared to soar into the heavens. The ground crew moved quickly, checking fuel levels, polishing the exterior, and making sure everything looked perfect. Inside the jet, the flight attendants were busy preparing the cabin. The air smelled faintly of fresh coffee and polished leather. Soft music played in the background as trays of fruits, juices, and fine breakfast dishes were carefully placed on the tables. The crew wanted everything to be flawless. After all, this was no ordinary flight. Among the crew was a young woman named Myra. She had been working as a flight attendant for 4 years, but today felt different. Her heart was racing with both excitement and worry. She had been told the passenger was someone very important, but no name had been revealed to her. Some said he was a business tycoon, others whispered he was a celebrity. Myra, however, only wanted to do her job well and prove her worth. Myra adjusted her uniform in the cabin mirror, smoothing down the navy blue fabric and straightening the golden pin on her chest. She tied her dark hair neatly into a bun, making sure not a single strand was out of place. Her brown skin glowed in the morning light streaming through the jet's windows. She whispered to herself, "You can do this. Just be calm and polite." As the time of departure came closer, the rest of the crew grew more alert. There was a mix of nervousness and excitement in the air. The captain had been given strict orders to wait for the passenger, no matter how long it took. The cabin chief reminded everyone, "This guest is extremely powerful. Whatever happens, stay professional." Finally, a black car rolled onto the tarmac and stopped near the jet stairs. The doors opened, and out stepped a tall man in a tailored gray suit. His confident stride and calm expression made it clear he was no ordinary traveler. His skin was dark, his posture strong, and his presence immediately commanded attention. He was the CEO everyone had been whispering about. The crew lined up to greet him as he entered the jet. His eyes scanned the cabin quickly, noticing every detail: the arrangement of the seats, the food on the table, even the expressions on the crew's faces. There was no arrogance in his gaze, but there was something sharp, like he could see through anyone pretending to be polite. Myra stepped forward, forcing a polite smile. "Welcome aboard, sir. I hope your journey will be comfortable." The man gave a short nod. His voice was deep but calm. "Thank you." He walked past her and settled into his seat by the window. For a moment, the jet grew quiet, as though everyone was waiting for his next move. Myra's hands trembled slightly as she poured him a glass of water. She placed it carefully on the table before him, hoping not to spill a single drop. The CEO looked out of the window, his mind clearly elsewhere. He seemed lost in thought, as if carrying a burden no one could see. Myra noticed the faint tiredness in his eyes and the way he leaned back in his seat with a heavy sigh. She wondered what kind of life a man like him must live: powerful, wealthy, admired by many, yet perhaps lonely in ways no one understood. The engines roared to life, and soon the jet lifted gracefully into the sky. Clouds drifted by the windows, and the city below grew smaller and smaller. Inside, however, the tension remained. Myra moved through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks, making sure everything was perfect. Yet, she could not shake the feeling that something unexpected was about to happen. The crew whispered quietly at the back of the cabin, discussing the passenger in hushed tones. Some admired his calm authority, others seemed almost afraid of him. Myra, however, felt curious. She wanted to know who he truly was, beyond the expensive suit and serious expression. As the flight continued, a small mistake by one of the attendants caused a glass to slip and fall near the CEO's seat. The sound of it shattering on the floor made everyone freeze. The cabin grew silent. Myra quickly bent down to clean it up, her heart pounding in her chest. The CEO looked at her, his expression unreadable. In that single moment, Myra felt her throat tighten. She did not know why, but something inside her warned her that this journey would not be like any other. She could not explain it, but deep in her heart, she felt this flight would change everything for her, for the crew, and maybe even for the man sitting so silently by the window. And as the jet cut through the clouds, carrying them higher and higher, fate quietly prepared its first test. The jet glided smoothly above the clouds, the soft hum of the engines filling the silence inside. Myra stood near the aisle, her hands folded neatly in front of her, trying to steady her breath. She had already served the passenger once, but the weight of his presence still lingered. The crew moved quietly, as if every small sound might disturb him. The CEO sat by the window, his gaze fixed far beyond the horizon. His sharp eyes were not simply looking out at the sky, they seemed to be chasing something invisible, something only he could see. He hardly touched the glass of water Myra had placed before him. Every now and then, he adjusted his cufflinks or leaned back with a faint sigh, as though his mind was battling with heavy thoughts. Myra noticed these small details. She could not stop herself. Though she told herself to stay professional, her eyes returned to him again and again. There was something about his silence that spoke louder than words. He was not simply a powerful man traveling for business. He looked like someone carrying a storm inside. The chief attendant, an older woman named Lila, pulled Myra aside. "Stay sharp," she whispered firmly. "This guest is not like others. Don't try to be too friendly, and don't make mistakes. One wrong move can cost you." Myra nodded quickly. "I understand." But deep inside, she felt uneasy. Why was there so much fear surrounding one man? Yes, he was important, perhaps one of the richest in the country, but he was still just a passenger. She wondered why the crew acted as if every breath depended on pleasing him. After a while, breakfast was served. Silver trays with fresh croissants, fruit, and warm tea were placed carefully before the CEO. Myra stood near, ready if he needed anything. The man finally turned his head, his deep voice breaking the silence. "Did you prepare this yourself?" he asked, looking directly at Myra. Her eyes widened. "No, sir. The kitchen staff arranged it. I only served it." He studied her for a moment, his gaze calm but piercing. He murmured, before lifting the cup of tea to his lips. The way he observed her left Myra unsettled. It was not unkind, yet it carried weight, like he was searching for something more than her words. She tried to smile politely, though her chest felt tight. The rest of the crew exchanged nervous glances. Lila gave Myra a sharp look, silently warning her not to speak too much. Myra understood, but her heart still beat fast. As the jet flew on, the sky outside began to darken with thick clouds. Lightning flickered in the distance, followed by a low rumble of thunder. The jet swayed gently, and Myra steadied herself against a seat. The passengers, however, remained calm. There was only one passenger, after all, and he showed no fear. Yet the storm outside seemed to mirror the storm building inside the cabin. At one point, the CEO placed his cup down and asked in a quiet tone, "What is your name?" The question surprised Myra. She quickly replied, "My name is Myra, sir." For a brief second, the man's serious face softened. He repeated her name slowly, almost thoughtfully. "Myra." Then he nodded once and leaned back in his seat again, closing his eyes as if retreating into his own world. The exchange was simple, but for Myra it felt heavy. No passenger had ever asked her name with such deliberate weight. She could not understand why, but it left her restless. Meanwhile, at the back of the jet, the other attendants began whispering. Some thought Myra was drawing too much attention. Others envied that the CEO had spoken to her directly. Lila, however, grew stricter. She pulled Myra aside once more, her voice sharp but low. You must not attract unnecessary notice, Lila said firmly. Do your duty and nothing more. Remember, one mistake can ruin us all. Myra bit her lip and nodded. She wanted to defend herself, to say she hadn't done anything wrong. But she held her tongue. She knew arguing would only make matters worse. Still, the words weighed on her. Was it truly so dangerous just to answer a question? The storm outside thickened, and the jet shook slightly as it passed through the clouds. Myra held onto the seat for balance. The CEO, however, remained still, his eyes half open as though the turbulence did not bother him. But then, something unexpected happened. One of the younger attendants stumbled as the jet shook, spilling a small amount of juice onto the edge of the CEO's table. It was a tiny mistake, barely noticeable, but the silence that followed was sharp. The young attendant's face turned pale as she quickly grabbed a cloth to wipe it clean. The CEO glanced at her, then at the table. His expression did not change, but his silence made the tension grow unbearable. The young attendant whispered an apology, almost shaking. Myra stepped forward instinctively, helping her clean the spill. It's all right, she said softly, her voice steady. The CEO's eyes rested on Myra again, holding her gaze for a moment longer than necessary. Something unreadable passed in his expression, but he said nothing. The crew, however, began murmuring again once he looked away. Lila's eyes burned with disapproval, clearly blaming Myra for stepping in when she wasn't asked to. And yet, Myra could not help it. Something about the CEO's silence, the way his eyes spoke without words, pulled her in. She felt a current running between them, invisible but undeniable. As the jet continued through the storm, Myra could not shake the feeling that the real turbulence was not in the sky but inside the cabin itself, tension waiting to break, emotions waiting to burst. And she did not know it yet, but the moment of that break was closer than anyone imagined. The storm outside began to fade, leaving the jet in calmer skies. The engines hummed steadily, and the clouds drifted past like waves of cotton. Inside the cabin, however, the atmosphere remained heavy. Every member of the crew was careful with their steps, careful with their words, as though one wrong move could spark a fire. Myra walked down the aisle, carrying a tray with fresh tea. She tried to stay calm, reminding herself that this was her duty, nothing more. But every time her eyes met the CEO's, something inside her grew restless. His silence had a weight that unsettled her, and his gaze seemed to pierce through her polite smile. The CEO had barely touched his breakfast. He leaned back in his seat, one arm resting on the armrest, his expression thoughtful. He looked more like a man lost in his own memories than someone simply flying across the sky. Myra approached slowly, setting the tea on the small table before him. "Your tea, sir," she said softly. He looked up at her, his eyes steady. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet stretched until it felt like the cabin itself was holding its breath. Then, in a deep and calm tone, he asked, "Do you always speak so little, Myra?" Her lips parted in surprise. She had not expected a personal question. "I only speak when I'm spoken to, sir," she replied quickly. The faintest trace of a smile tugged at the corner of his mouth. "And if I asked you to speak freely?" Myra's heart beat faster. She glanced around, noticing Lila and the others watching closely from the back of the cabin. They would not approve of this. Still, she whispered, I would not know what to say." Before the CEO could reply, Lila stepped forward quickly, her voice firm. "Sir, would you like anything else? Perhaps another dish?" Her interruption was polite, but Myra felt the sharpness behind it. Lila did not want Myra speaking with him. The CEO, however, did not even turn his head toward Lila. His eyes remained on Myra for another moment, then he lifted the cup of tea and took a sip. The silence that followed was tense. Myra excused herself and stepped back, trying to steady her hands. She felt caught between two forces: the strict orders of her crew and the strange attention of the CEO. Moments later, a small accident turned that tension into something far greater. As Myra carried an empty tray back to the kitchen, one of the younger attendants bumped into her. The tray tilted, and before she could stop it, a cup slid off the edge. Myra reached out quickly, but it slipped past her hand and landed near the CEO, splashing a few drops of tea onto his suit sleeve. The cabin froze. Everyone stared, their eyes wide. Myra's breath caught in her throat. "I'm so sorry," she gasped, rushing forward with a cloth. She bent down to dab at the drops on his sleeve, her hands trembling. The CEO did not move. His eyes followed her closely, calm but unreadable. The silence stretched too long, and Myra's fear grew heavier. She could feel the weight of the entire crew's eyes burning into her back. In her panic, as she leaned forward too quickly, her hand brushed too firmly against his arm. The CEO shifted slightly, and Myra lost her balance. She reached out to steady herself, and before she realized what had happened, her palm landed sharply across his shoulder and grazed his cheek. The sound was soft, but in the silent cabin, it echoed like thunder. Myra froze. Her hand trembled in the air as if it no longer belonged to her. Her heart dropped to her stomach. She had not meant it, she knew she had not, but to anyone watching, it looked like she had slapped him. Gasps filled the cabin. One of the attendants dropped a tray in shock, the plates clattering loudly on the floor. Lila's face turned pale, her mouth open in disbelief. The younger attendants exchanged panicked glances, as if the world had just ended. Myra's lips shook as she tried to speak. I didn't mean, but the words refused to come. Her throat closed, and her eyes filled with tears of dread. The CEO remained perfectly still. He did not raise his voice. He did not even flinch. He simply looked at her, his dark eyes calm and steady. The silence in his gaze was louder than any shout. 10 long seconds passed. No one dared move. No one dared breathe. Finally, the CEO leaned back in his seat, adjusting the sleeve of his suit where the tea had spilled. His face showed no anger, no surprise, only a strange quietness that no one could read. Myra lowered her hands slowly, her whole body trembling. She wanted to sink into the floor and disappear. She wanted to explain, to beg for forgiveness, but her voice would not come. Lila stepped forward quickly, her voice sharp but respectful. "Sir, please forgive her. It was an accident. I will handle this immediately." Still, the CEO said nothing. He simply lifted his cup of tea again, as if nothing had happened, and took a slow sip. But his silence was not relief. It was heavier than anger. It was the kind of silence that made everyone's chest tighten with fear of what might come next. And Myra, standing frozen with tears in her eyes, knew in her heart that her life would never be the same after this moment. The slap had not been real, not in her intention. But the impact of it on her, on the crew, and on the powerful man before her was only just beginning. The cabin was frozen in silence. Even the sound of the engine seemed far away, as if the whole world had paused inside the jet. Myra stood motionless, her hands still trembling, her chest rising and falling with shallow breaths. The accidental slap lingered in the air like an echo that refused to fade. Every crew member's eyes were fixed on the CEO. Some waited for him to shout. Others expected him to demand Myra's immediate removal. Lila's fingers gripped the edge of the seat in front of her, her knuckles turning white. She wanted to intervene, but she too was waiting for the storm to break. But the storm never came. The CEO adjusted the cuff of his suit and placed the empty cup back onto the table. His expression remained unreadable, calm to the point of mystery. He did not raise his voice, nor did he show anger. Instead, he leaned back into his seat and rested his hand lightly against his chin, as though lost in thought. Myra could hardly breathe. She lowered her eyes to the floor, her voice caught in her throat. "Sir, I'm truly sorry," she whispered, but her words came out so faint that no one knew if he had even heard them. The silence stretched painfully long. The crew shifted nervously in the back, whispering to one another. To them, the quiet was more frightening than any scolding could have been. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the CEO spoke. His tone was calm, almost too calm. "Why are you afraid?" he asked softly, his eyes resting on Myra. Myra blinked, unsure how to answer. She looked up slowly, meeting his gaze for a brief second before dropping her eyes again. Because I made a mistake," she said, her voice trembling. The corner of his lips curved slightly, not in a smile but in something unreadable. "Mistakes happen," he murmured. "But fear is often heavier than the mistake itself." The words stunned everyone. They had expected anger, not wisdom. They had prepared themselves for punishment, not reflection. The CEO's voice carried no judgment, only depth, as if he were speaking from a place of experience. Myra felt tears prick her eyes. She wanted to thank him, to explain again that it was an accident, but her lips would not move. The moment felt too fragile to disturb. Lila quickly stepped forward, bowing slightly. "Sir, I assure you this will not happen again. I will discipline the staff immediately." Her voice shook slightly, betraying her nerves. The CEO did not even look at her. His gaze remained on Myra for a few seconds longer, then he turned toward the window, watching the clouds drift past. "Discipline is easy," he said quietly, almost to himself. "But understanding is harder." His words fell heavy in the room, like a secret message none of them could fully grasp. The crew exchanged uneasy glances. Some felt relief that he had not reacted with anger, while others grew even more tense, unsure what his silence truly meant. Lila pressed her lips together, clearly unsettled by the fact that she no longer controlled the situation. Myra remained frozen near his seat, unsure if she should stay or step away. Her heart raced with confusion. She had expected the worst: anger, humiliation, maybe even losing her job. Instead, she was left with something stranger: his quietness, his strange calm, and the sense that he saw more than anyone else could. Minutes passed, and the cabin returned to its routines. The younger attendants cleaned up the mess quietly, their hands shaking slightly. Lila gave Myra sharp looks, silently warning her to keep her distance. But even as Myra tried to retreat to the back of the cabin, she felt the CEO's silence following her like a shadow. The flight continued smoothly, but no one could focus. Every small movement, every glance, carried tension. The man in the gray suit had not raised his voice, yet his silence controlled the entire crew. At one point, Myra went to the small service area to catch her breath. She leaned against the counter, her hands gripping its edge tightly. Her chest still ached with the weight of fear. One of the younger attendants approached her, whispering quickly. "What were you thinking? You touched him. No one dares to do that." "I didn't mean to," Myra said softly, shaking her head. "It was an accident." "Accident or not, it looked like a slap," the attendant whispered sharply. "And he didn't even get angry." "That's worse. What if he's planning something?" Myra's stomach tightened. She had thought the same. His silence was kind, but it was also dangerous. She could not tell if he had forgiven her or if he was simply waiting. Hours passed, and the flight neared its destination. The storm outside had faded into clear blue skies, but inside, the tension remained as thick as ever. Myra carried out her duties quietly, avoiding unnecessary contact. Yet no matter how hard she tried, she felt the CEO's presence pulling her attention again and again. As the jet prepared for landing, the CEO finally broke his silence once more. He placed his briefcase on the table, his deep voice filling the cabin. "This is not about the tea," he said suddenly, his eyes sweeping across the crew. "It is about what I have seen today." The crew froze, their hearts pounding. Myra's hands went cold as she looked at him, unsure what he meant. The CEO leaned forward, his voice steady, his words deliberate. "I have seen fear, whispers, and eyes that avoid the truth. Do you think I do not notice?" No one answered. The cabin was filled with silence once again. Myra felt her heart hammer in her chest. She had no idea what he was planning, but she knew this was only the beginning. And as the wheels of the jet prepared to touch the ground, one thing was certain: this flight was not ending quietly. The wheels of the jet touched the runway with a smooth thud, and the cabin tilted slightly as the engine slowed. Outside, the runway stretched wide under the afternoon sun, but inside, the tension only grew heavier. The CEO's words still lingered in the air, making every crew member uneasy. Myra sat in the service area, her fingers gripping the edge of her seat tightly. She could still hear his voice in her mind: "I have seen fear, whispers, and eyes that avoid the truth." Those words had not been directed at her alone, they had been aimed at the entire crew. And yet, Myra felt as though he had seen straight through her. The cabin chief, Lila, moved briskly through the aisle, giving instructions to the staff. Her face was tight with worry, though she tried to hide it. "Stand ready," she told them. "Once we land fully, we will escort him off politely. Do not say more than necessary." But her voice lacked confidence. She too was shaken. As the jet taxied toward a private hangar, the CEO calmly gathered his briefcase. His movements were smooth, unhurried. He gave no sign of anger, but the weight of his silence made the crew feel smaller with every passing second. When the jet finally came to a halt, the door was opened and the stairs lowered. Usually, this was the moment when the crew relaxed, knowing their job was almost complete. But this time, no one relaxed. Every step, every breath, carried unease. The CEO stood, tall and composed. His sharp eyes swept across the cabin once more. Then, without raising his voice, he spoke. "Before I leave, I want to share something with you." The crew froze. They were not used to passengers addressing them in this way. Myra's chest tightened as she waited, her hands clasped together. The CEO paused, his voice deep and steady. "This jet is not yours." The words confused everyone. They exchanged puzzled glances. Of course it wasn't theirs, the airline company owned it, or so they thought. Lila forced a nervous smile and replied, "Yes, sir, it belongs to the company." But the CEO's gaze hardened slightly. "No," he said firmly. "It belongs to me." The words dropped like heavy stones into the cabin. The silence that followed was sharper than any shout. The crew looked at one another in shock. Myra's mouth parted slightly, but no sound came out. She could hardly believe it. "You," Lila stammered, her confidence breaking. "You own this jet?" The CEO's eyes moved to her slowly. "I do. And I own much more than this jet. Every detail you have been managing so carefully, all of it belongs to me." The crew's faces turned pale. They had been treating him as just another powerful passenger, not realizing he was the one at the very top, the one who held authority over them all. Myra's heart raced. No wonder his silence carried so much weight. No wonder he had not reacted with anger. He didn't need to. His power was already beyond question. The CEO's voice remained calm, but it cut through the air like a blade. "I have watched the way you work. I have listened to the whispers. I have seen how fear controls your actions more than respect does. And I know which of you serves with sincerity, and which of you only pretends." His eyes lingered briefly on Myra, then moved back to the rest of the crew. Myra's breath caught. She didn't know whether to feel afraid or relieved. Lila stepped forward quickly, her words tumbling out. "Sir, we had no idea. Please forgive us if anything seemed unprofessional." "We always try our best to do you," the CEO interrupted quietly. His voice was not loud, but it silenced her instantly. Trying your best does not mean hiding behind fear. It does not mean blaming one another when something goes wrong. It does not mean whispering instead of facing the truth. His words struck deeply. The crew stood in silence, their faces lowered. Myra felt her eyes sting with tears, not from shame alone but from the truth in his voice. He stepped closer to the exit, then stopped. Turning back, he spoke again. "A single mistake does not destroy trust. But a culture of fear, that destroys everything." The words hung in the air, heavy and unforgettable. Myra could not stop herself. She spoke in a trembling voice, barely above a whisper. "Then, why did you not get angry? Why did you stay silent when I made that mistake?" The CEO's gaze softened for the briefest moment as his eyes rested on her. "Because silence teaches louder than anger. You will remember this moment far longer than any shout." Myra's chest tightened, her eyes glistening. His words pierced straight into her heart. Without saying another word, the CEO stepped off the jet, his tall figure disappearing down the stairs. The crew remained frozen, as though time itself had stopped. When the door closed again, Lila turned sharply toward the attendants. "Do you understand what just happened?" she hissed. Her voice was low, but her fear was clear. "We were serving the owner of this jet, and we failed." No one replied. Their hearts were still racing. Myra sat quietly in the corner, her thoughts spinning. She replayed his words again and again in her mind: "Silence teaches louder than anger." She knew then that this flight was not the end of the story. It was only the beginning of something far bigger, something that would shake not just the crew but all of their futures. And as the engines cooled and the runway fell quiet, Myra felt a strange certainty: the next time she saw him, everything would change. The cabin grew silent after the CEO's departure. The crew stood in small groups, whispering nervously, their voices low and unsteady. For years, they had worked on this jet, believing it was only part of the company's fleet. Never had they imagined it belonged to the very man they had just served. Lila paced back and forth, her heels clicking softly on the polished floor. Her face was pale, but her eyes were sharp. "You all must understand," she said quickly, "this is dangerous." He saw everything. He saw the mistakes, the whispers. If he is truly the owner, then he has the power to decide our future. The younger attendants exchanged frightened glances. Some bit their lips, others fidgeted with their uniforms. The weight of uncertainty pressed on them all. Myra, however, sat quietly in one of the seats, her hands folded tightly in her lap. She felt both anxious and strangely calm. The CEO's words still echoed in her mind: "Silence teaches louder than anger." There had been no cruelty in his eyes, no desire to embarrass her. Instead, there had been something else, something deeper. She could not explain it, but she felt he had seen her not as a mistake, but as a person. Just as the crew began to gather their belongings, the cabin door opened again. The sound of footsteps climbing the stairs filled the silence, and every heart in the room skipped a beat. He was back. The CEO stepped inside once more, his tall frame commanding the space with ease. His suit was still sharp, his posture strong. He carried no anger on his face, but his presence alone was enough to make everyone stand straighter. Lila rushed forward with a forced smile. "Sir, welcome back. Is there something you left behind? Perhaps he raised a hand slightly, and she fell silent at once. His eyes moved slowly across the crew, pausing briefly on each face. When his gaze landed on Myra, it lingered a heartbeat longer before moving on. "I did not forget anything," he said firmly. "I returned because there is unfinished business here." The crew's stomachs dropped. They had been hoping he would leave quietly, that this frightening moment would pass. Instead, it was only beginning. He walked to the center of the cabin and placed his briefcase on the table. His deep voice filled the space with calm authority. "I watched how you worked today. I saw your fear. And I saw something else, something I cannot ignore." The attendants held their breath. He continued, his eyes narrowing slightly. "This jet is mine, yes. But it is more than that. It represents trust. I trust the people who serve here, the ones who make sure every journey runs smoothly. And today, I needed to see the truth. The truth." The word cut through them all like a blade. Lila straightened her back quickly, speaking with forced confidence. "Sir, if there were mistakes, they were small. We can correct them immediately. Please allow us another chance to." "Enough," he said quietly, but the power in his voice silenced her completely. He turned his gaze toward the younger attendants. "Do you know what I heard while sitting in this seat?" They shook their heads nervously. "I heard whispers," he said. "Not teamwork, not encouragement, but whispers of fear and blame. You watched one of your own struggle, and instead of stepping forward, you hid behind silence. That is not service. That is not respect." His words made several attendants lower their heads in shame. Myra felt her throat tighten. She remembered how quick the others had been to criticize her, how Lila had warned her again and again not to speak. Then his eyes shifted back to Myra. His tone softened slightly, though it still carried strength. "And you," he said, "you made a mistake. But you faced it. You did not hide, even when you were afraid. Do you know how rare that is?" Myra's lips parted, but no words came. Her chest ached with a mix of fear and gratitude. She felt the eyes of the entire crew burning into her, but she kept her gaze on him, steady though her hands trembled. The CEO leaned forward slightly, his voice low but clear. "I do not measure people by perfection. I measure them by courage. And today, you were the only one who showed it." The crew gasped softly. Some looked shocked, others resentful. Lila's jaw tightened, her eyes sharp with frustration. The CEO straightened and glanced at his watch. "I did not return to argue. I returned to make a decision." The cabin froze. No one dared breathe. He placed a hand on his briefcase and spoke slowly, each word carrying weight. "In 10 minutes, this crew will no longer serve on this jet." Gasps filled the room. Panic spread like fire. Lila's face turned red as she stepped forward, her voice rising. "Sir, you cannot mean that. We have years of service, experience, loyalty." His voice cut her off like steel. "Loyalty is not measured in years. It is measured in truth." Silence followed, sharp and absolute. Myra's heart pounded in her chest. She could hardly believe what she had just heard. The entire crew gone? Fired? It felt impossible, and yet his voice left no space for doubt. The CEO glanced at her one last time, his eyes steady, before turning toward the window. 10 minutes, he repeated. And then, everything changes. The cabin filled with the sound of quiet sobs and panicked whispers. But Myra sat frozen, her mind spinning. She had no idea what her own fate would be. All she knew was that the silence of this man had turned into a storm and it was about to sweep them all away. The cabin was quiet except for the soft hum of the engines and the muted voices of the crew. Every person's heart was pounding. The CEO's words had left them shaken, and the tension hung thick in the air. Myra sat quietly in her seat, trying to calm her racing thoughts. She knew something monumental was about to happen. The CEO stood in the center of the cabin, his posture calm but commanding. He let his eyes sweep across the crew one final time. His gaze was steady, precise, and full of authority. There was no anger in his eyes, but a depth of judgment that made everyone feel small. Today, he began, his voice deep and firm, I have seen more than mistakes. I have seen fear, hesitation, and dishonesty. And I have seen courage, honesty, and dedication. The crew held their breath. Some looked shocked, others frightened. Myra felt her chest tighten, unsure of what would come next. I cannot allow fear to run this jet, the CEO continued. This is my jet, my responsibility, and my trust is not given lightly. Therefore, he paused, letting the words settle like stones in the cabin. I am letting go of the entire crew. A collective gasp filled the space. Lila's face turned pale. The younger attendants froze, unable to believe what they were hearing. Some whispered among themselves, desperately hoping he would change his mind. Myra felt her stomach drop. Her mind raced. Fired. Every thought she had built, every ounce of her effort, seemed to be about to disappear. But then the CEO's gaze returned to her. His eyes softened, though the firmness in his voice remained. However, he said, there is one exception. The crew stiffened, and Myra's heart skipped a beat. Could he be referring to her? You, he said, pointing directly at Myra. You have shown courage today. You did not hide from your mistake. You faced it. You did not whisper, you did not blame. You acted with honesty and responsibility, even when fear gripped you. Myra's eyes widened. Her lips parted, but no words came. She felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, a mixture of relief and disbelief washing over her. Because of this, the CEO continued, I am offering you a place to serve here permanently, under my supervision. Not because you are perfect, but because you have the strength to learn, to act, and to serve with integrity. The rest of the crew stared in disbelief. Lila's mouth hung open, unable to speak. The younger attendants felt their hearts sink as they realized their fate. The CEO turned back toward the exit of the jet, his steps measured. You all will leave this jet. Take what you need and depart. The future of this aircraft requires trust and truth, not fear and whispers. The crew moved slowly, gathering their things, some of them too shocked to even speak. Myra watched quietly, her mind a whirl of emotions. She felt sadness for those leaving, but she also felt an unfamiliar strength growing inside her. Once the last of the crew had left, Myra stepped forward. Her legs felt weak, but her gaze was steady. Sir, she whispered, her voice trembling slightly, thank you. I will do my best. The CEO nodded, his deep eyes meeting hers. I know you will. That is why you remain. He gestured toward the cabin, signaling for her to continue her duties. Myra moved through the jet with a sense of purpose she had never felt before. Each step felt lighter, yet every movement carried the weight of responsibility. The engines roared softly as the jet taxied to its hangar. Outside, the sun had begun to set, painting the sky in shades of gold and pink. Myra looked out the window and felt a strange sense of hope. The day had begun with fear, tension, and uncertainty, but it ended with clarity, trust, and opportunity. As the CEO returned to his seat, he glanced at Myra once more. Remember, he said quietly, perfection is not required. Integrity, honesty, and courage, these are what matter most. Myra nodded, feeling the words sink into her heart. She understood now that mistakes were not the end, but a chance to show character, responsibility, and resilience. The jet lifted off again, gliding smoothly into the twilight sky. Myra moved with confidence now, aware that she had been given a second chance, a chance to prove herself, to learn, and to grow. She had faced fear, and in doing so, had earned trust. And though the cabin was empty of the crew she had known, Myra felt a quiet strength. She knew that life was full of moments that tested courage. Some moments would challenge her, some would frighten her, and some would seem impossible. But she had learned that facing those moments, even in fear, could change everything. As the private jet soared higher, Carrying the CEO and his chosen attendant through the fading light, Myra felt that the journey was just beginning. The lessons of the day would remain with her forever, lessons of courage, responsibility, and the truth that sometimes, silence speaks louder than anger, and honesty matters more than fear. And with that, the jet disappeared into the horizon, carrying the promise of a new future, not just for Myra, but for everyone who dared to act with integrity.